The next bill on the calendar for today is House File 2309. The Chief Clerk will report the bill.
House File number 2309, number 5 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to housing, the first engrossment.
There are amendments at the desk. If there is no objection, we will let the author explain the bill before we act on the amendments. I recognize the author from Anoka, Representative Rayhauer, who will introduce the bill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. House File 2309, our housing policy bill, includes agency corrections and updates in addition to the language from 5 housing policy bills that had bipartisan support and passed through our Housing Committee. The first update ensures wage theft is not going on in all low-income housing tax credit awards by covering all allocating agencies and now also the sub-allocators. They will be required to use responsible contractors and, when applicable, create wage theft prevention plans. There's also an update to terminology throughout so that it matches. And in addition, it modifies the Bring It Home statewide rental assistance program to allow the agency to distribute funds by formula to make things more straightforward. There's a change made so that in the event there are vouchers that weren't able to be placed in an area, the agency is allowed to move them around in order to ensure utilization. So you see many of these are common sense adjustments that will help make our housing policies more effective. There's an update to a grant program that allows for a school to take on building a home with support from students so that now a nonprofit can be able to handle the overseeing of the process and payments. So the school can really just focus on getting the students out there and actively building those homes if they so choose. There's a slight change to exclude an individual serving as a nonprofit volunteer board member from the definition of officer, to allow a carve-out so that if that board member isn't receiving any financial benefit from the building of the development and who would not have a financial interest in the project can be a part of that. Another change allowed projects not to be subject to income requirements under the state housing tax credit program, but this is only if it has received a Workforce Housing Development Program award. Because of the Workforce Housing and Development Program, that doesn't have those income limits, so there's better consistency there. There's a requirement that if there's income generated from this program, for example, interest earned on loans, that money must go back into the program. We updated so that state and local language matches. We also have a time frame change for a grantee to use grant funds from 8 years to 5 years so that we can align with the Office of Grants Management Practices. Then we have representative provision from Representative Knorr's bill, House File 1334. This changes the height requirements for the high-rise sprinkler program to clarify the eligibility requirements. There was a building in Hopkins, for example, that had the correct number of stories, but in terms of feet was just this much too short. So we want, again, to make common sense language changes so that it matches the intent of the program. We also modify the building income requirements to now allow up to 60% of AMI because there weren't enough applicants with the language the way it was drafted. So these changes will open it up a bit. There are also situations where we award funds to a tax credit project, then we would need to provide this funding through a loan rather than a grant to ensure we're meeting the IRS rules. We have a provision from Chair Howard's bill, House File 2480. This was a technical bill, but it's very important to public housing authorities and thousands of Minnesotans that live in public housing. The public housing authorities have to maximize every last dollar to address their community needs, and basically in order to leverage federal dollars through HUD, there's a path that will allow these public housing authorities to reposition and create a new entity to unlock these resources. MMB decided there were potential constitutional issues with terming them as being wholly public. So right now they would have to choose between accessing federal resources or unlocking state general obligation bonds. We fixed that, again, a common sense correction to make sure it's clear in our state statute that they could do both and that they are in fact public entities, which they are. It includes a provision from Representative Nash's bill, House File 1902, This bill requires HFA to promote information on the rights and obligations of landlords and residential tenants. This information must be prominently displayed on the agency website. This will be a very common sense approach and will answer questions and solve issues for both landlords and tenants before they become larger concerns. We have a provision from Vice Chair Kozlowski's bill, House File 1548. This is a straightforward bill that adds housing and redevelopment authorities, or HRAs, to the definition of local government. This will allow our HRAs to establish local housing trust funds. They are largely financed by HRA levies, so this change allows for easier administration of these important funds and the important work our housing trust funds do. And finally, there is a provision from Representative Fu Lee's bill, House File 1340. This bill will expand the use of housing infrastructure bonds for adaptive reuse for the development of both supportive housing and very low-income housing. There have been several requests come in to repurpose school buildings, and public school buildings are actually the second largest public infrastructure we have in our nation. Second only to our nation's highway system. So if communities have asked us how they could repurpose this older empty school building, this is one example of how those building uses could be expanded. So thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to co-chairs Howard and Igo for setting an example of how bipartisan committee work can be done well. Thank you to co-chairs Kozlowski and Dotseth for doing the same. And a special thank you to all those original bill authors, Vice Chair Kozlowski, Representative Noor, Representative Nash, Chair Howard, and Representative Fu Lee for bringing forward such great partisan bills to our Housing Committee. Thank you, and I urge all to vote green.
I recognize the member from Itasca, Representative Igo.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I don't know if there's much more to say than that. You did such a great job explaining the whole bill, and that's all I'll say to that. Thank you.
There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Fisher moves to amend House Bill number 2309, the first engrossment. The amendment is coded A23.
I recognize the member from Ramsey, Representative Fisher, to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This amendment is to start addressing a problem that has come to light in my area. I've got a situation where there were several people who were disabled, that were a couple that were in a unit where we had spent in government dollars over $86,000 to make the unit accommodating for them. In the process, the landlord changed, and the new landlord coming in decided that while the final improvements were being made, after they were made, the new landlord decided to evict the people. So we've got over $86,000 of government investment into this unit, and the people are no longer able to stay there. This was an investment that helped make it very accommodating to them so that they didn't need as much in government services and personal care attendants. Some of the things that came to light in the process is that there are temporary improvements that were made, but unfortunately they were attached to the facility, and as a result, under current tenant law, they were not able to take them with them. And as a result, this shows some of the highlights. These were also improvements that they'd made in other landlord establishments when they had rental agreements before that they're able to take with them. Now they cannot. So what this bill does is get to the situation is that allowing where we've got temporary improvements made that could go, and examples of these would be for wheelchairs. Now these days, a lot of the wheelchairs have charging stations that get attached to the unit. Well, if they're attached to the unit, that means they can no longer take it with them. So if you've got a wheelchair and you leave, you got to leave your charging statement behind because it's now attached to the unit, becomes property of the tenant person, of the landlord. In addition, another example is metal temporary ramps. You have to secure those so they don't blow away, but once you secure them, that's considered now part of the landlord's. And these are examples of several things that are temporary that should go along that we consider as medical equipment. Now, I know there's a lot of work that we need to address this going forward. I do appreciate Chair Igo and Chair Howard giving the opportunity to have the original amendment heard. I've been working with different groups to continue to improve this bill so that we can get to some of the basics. And I also know I'm going to have some provisions coming up in other bills to get to the bigger problems out there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to withdraw the amendment, and I know I have agreement from Chair Igo and Chair Howard that I'll continue working on it, and if we get some peace in the valley, which I think we'll be able to get to, I've got more language that came to me since we've been meeting today, that as we get agreement, that I would hope that you consider it in conference committee as it goes forward. So thank you for the opportunity.
Representative Fisher withdraws the amendment. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Ray Rauer moves to amend House Bill number 2309, the first engrossment. The amendment is coded A24.
I recognize a member from Anoka, Representative Ray Rauer.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. This is a very straightforward amendment. It removes a provision from House File 1064 from the bill. Since it's a tax bill, we hope that will become part of the larger tax bill instead. It also modifies this one more modification to the Bring It Home statewide rental assistance program. And this is so that those on the program could potentially stay on this program if their income were to go just that little bit above 50% threshold. But if their household income dedicated to rent is still at or above 30%. So thank you, Madam Speaker.
I recognize the member from Itasca, Representative Igo.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Good amendment. We can vote green.
All those in favor? Aye. Aye. Any opposed? Nay. No. The motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. There are no further amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House Bill number 2309 as amended.
Third reading. Discussion to the bill. I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Howard.
Members, I'll just speak briefly and thank all the members that provided their bills for this pretty narrow housing policy bill. It's a bunch of things that add up to be important work from a policy perspective, and I hope folks can vote yes. Thank you.
I recognize the member from Carlton, Representative Dotseth.
Madam Chair, I don't have nothing else to say. Vote green.
I recognize the member from Anoka, Representative Ray Rauer.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll just reaffirm. Please vote green.
I recognize the member from St. Louis, Representative Kozlowski.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. Everybody else was short, but you put an Ojibwe on the microphone for last, so I do have some comments to make about the housing policy bill before we wrap tonight. And that is that housing is stability. And the conversations that we've been having on the floor and in the committee, we know that we all do better when we have a place to call home and a place to belong. Whether we're trying to improve educational outcomes, close racial wealth gaps, or grow our local economy across the state, no matter what way you cut it, all roads lead back to home. But the reality right now that we're facing is Minnesotans are being priced out of our communities and priced out of their homes in every corner. Over 690,000 Minnesotans are cost burdened and living on the edge. We also have stagnant wages that are forcing people to live paycheck to paycheck. And people are faced with impossible decisions. They're not making bad choices. They have bad choices. Pay the rent or put groceries on your table. Stay in your community and move miles away from your work. That's not just a huge number. 690,000 Minnesotans is a quarter of Minnesotans, and those are parents and seniors, people with disabilities, veterans, home care workers, to nurses and educators. And the message that we're hearing from Minnesotans is clear. It's not very Minnesota nice when you can't afford a place to live in your own community. And thanks to the work of this committee, we said that we agreed. And I also want to echo the thanks that have been shared about Chair Igo with Chair Howard also Vice Chair Dotseth. I think Greater Minnesota, we're getting it done. It's important that we're making sure we're not leaving anybody behind border to border. To our amazing staff, to our whole committee, to the community and the partners and the advocates who pushed us to this moment where we said that we are going to change the course. We're going to write a different story. Our community worked hand in hand on this policy bill that's before us, and I want to give kudos to Representative Ray Rauer for your work as well with our technical policy bill. We've sent a clear message, and we know that for Minnesotans that this policy bill might seem small, but the reality is that the little things are the big things to Minnesotans. And there's actually some good stuff in here that I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of. That we went on a bonding tour to over 60 cities across Minnesota, and communities over and over, they said, with a little love and some attention and a little policy change, we can take vacant office building spaces and community spaces and repurpose those, especially for the kind of housing that's most deeply affordable for our lowest income neighbors. I also heard in remarks earlier and want to just say that the work that we did last biennium on tenant-landlord protections as well as evictions reforms was actually the win. Those are super important for leveling the playing field because 30% of Minnesotans are renters. And so we know that we have more work to be done, but right now we have tenants who are mobilizing and exerting and practicing their rights to make sure that they don't get evicted at a time that we're seeing escalation in evictions, that they have a right to their emergency repairs. This isn't just about bricks and mortar. And at a time where, I wasn't going to say this on the floor, but I would be remiss to talk about, it's almost exactly a year since many of you know my brother, Stephen Nelson, passed away in the streets up in Duluth, overdosing and homelessness. And so I think that the moment that we're in where we are facing all of these challenges, we also have a federal government that is working against us and making our homeless crisis more challenging with cutting LIHEAP, with threats to Section 8 vouchers. Well, my mom and my brother were both people who needed that emergency rental assistance. My mom, before I got elected, she passed away, and I got a letter from our local HRA that said, "Congratulations, you are awarded an access a voucher, 3 months too late." And my brother is somebody who, the work that we did last biennium to preserve housing, to create 5,000 more new homes and growing, to make sure that we're getting pathways to home ownership, we didn't get that done in time to help people like my brother. But I think the work of this policy bill and the finance bill sure is important and renews my commitment, and I hope renews your fervor, that we can press on, and we must press on, that we have the Minnesota nightmare with our housing crisis, that we can make that the dream again attainable for housing and guaranteed. And so I know folks want to wrap, but I think it's so important that we don't lose sight that housing is the foundation, and when you don't have it, everything else crumbles. And so I just want to reground us in the good work that we've done, but also just say that it's not enough and we need to keep going. You know, the Wilder Foundation puts out the homelessness study every 3 years, and we know that the work of our committee with the policies to tackle the racial wealth gaps, there's 27,000 Minnesotans who are people of color and ready to step up into home ownership. And thanks to the good work that we did together with the first-gen home ownership, 600 of those were housed in the first 7 months of that program. While the state's indigenous population makes up 20%, 2%, our homeless population makes up 20%. And that's not right and that's not fair. And so I just want to urge you that we have a lot of work to do. We've talked about the zoning reforms. We talked about the work to build more housing with less barriers to accessing it. This is our moment, and this is the movement that we can lead. And so I just urge you to vote green, to put us on a path to saying yes to challenging the status quo, yes to building tenant power, yes to building more homes, big no to ending to more homelessness and yes to ending it, and a yes to homes for every single Minnesotan, safe, stable, and affordable. Thank you, members. Vote green.
There being no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll. The clerk will call the names of the members participating remotely.
Hussein. McDonald.
McDonald, yes. Aye.
McDonald votes aye. Perez Vega. Perez Vega.
Okay. Go ahead. Perez, yes.
Perez Vega, aye.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 109 yeas, 22 nays, the bill as amended is passed and its title is agreed to.